Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Butler Township in western Pennsylvania. Around the town of Butler, dense and large stands of trees encircle the town in a beautiful touch of wilderness, or about as close as you can get to it in this area. About 30 miles to the south, the large city of Pittsburgh bustles with car and industry noise of any modern major city. But Butler is much more quiet and peaceful. On the outskirts of town are expansive farms and fields, reaching out around 10 miles away from the city. These fields are interrupted by creek bottoms that have dense riparian zones of trees and brush, creating travel routes for all kinds of wildlife. In a housing development north of Butler called Homeacre-Lyndora Housing Development, the homes back up to a beautiful stretch of woods that still have their untouched character. Area residents have been seeing black bears around their neighborhood over the last decade or so. In fact, it isn't uncommon for residents to get footage of bears on their doorbell cameras during the night. When Nancy Godineaux, a resident on Jarret Avenue, reported a sighting of a bear, local authorities warned her to remove any bird feeders and to walk her dog during the daylight hours. Nancy had spotted over 10 bears in her neighborhood in the last month, and being from the city, wasn't exactly comfortable with their presence. She reported that a bear had recently followed her dog to her front door, leaving evidence of its prints in the snow. Godineaux was advised to put up a fence around her property to keep the bears from entering. Over on Belfield Drive, 55-year-old Leanne Galante was winding down for the night while her husband was out of the house. Lee worked as a dental hygienist and was excited about a trip she'd planned to Italy, set to begin in a month. She had never been overseas, and looked forward to this adventure. Her constant companion was her 7-year-old Pomeranian dog, Smokey, who tipped the scales at only 8 pounds. She was a black fuzzball of energy and affection for Leanne. The Galantes had their own history with the local black bear population. In 2009, one of their bird feeders was knocked down by a visiting black bear, and then the bears returned in February 2024. Her neighbors had doorbell video footage of a sow with 3 large cubs visiting the neighborhood bird feeders and rummaging in trash cans for food. At 8:30 p.m. on Tuesday, March 5, 2024, Leanne was headed toward the back door to let Smokey take a bedtime potty break. As she turned on the lights, she could see the backlit silhouette of 3 large black bear cubs in a neighbor's tree close to her property. She glanced around and didn't see any other bears and wondered if the cubs were already on their own. She closed the door and retreated inside a few steps before hearing Smokey barking incessantly. Deciding she had better investigate what Smokey was up to, Leanne opened the back door to her home once again and stepped into the dark a few steps for a better view. Leanne examined the shadows of her backyard and took a few steps towards Smokey, who was barking near the garden. There was a fence around the garden, and as she peered into the darkness, a huge, angry sow black bear climbed over it and started closing in on Smokey. As the black bear charged toward Smokey, it huffed and chuffed in rage at the nuisance the little dog presented. Leanne immediately began yelling for Smokey to come to her. She was afraid that the bear would kill Smokey, and screamed to stop the bear from getting to her dog. The sow quickly approached Smokey, then turned its head toward Leanne. Curving its path toward Leanne, the bear streaked toward her at speed too fast for her to consider reacting. She managed to turn slightly away from the bear before feeling an overwhelming force slam her to the concrete slab of her back patio. As the smack of her head resounded, the dental hygienist's only fears were that her teeth might be broken. Before Leanne could come to her senses, the sow bit her left arm and tossed her head, causing pain to shoot through Leanne's body. Smokey wasn't about to let her buddy fight this bear alone, and darted in and out, barking and growling to draw the bear's attention away from Leanne. For an instant, the bear was distracted by Smokey and chased after the little dog. After Smokey scampered to a safe distance, the sow returned to Leanne and bit onto the back of her head. Feeling the bear's teeth sink into her scalp, Leanne screamed out for help in terror. Leanne's neighbor, Michael Vero, heard her cries for help. Her screams were nerve-wracking to him, and he wasn't sure what was going on next door. As the bear chewed on her head, Leanne was terrified that the sow was going to scalp her. The pressure of the bear's bite was irresistible, and the pain it caused was crippling. Leanne couldn't believe this was happening. She was convinced that this was it. She was going to die by a bear attack in her own backyard. That is when Smokey stormed back in for another distracting maneuver. The sow immediately turned her head toward the dog and dashed in that direction. Leanne was worried that the bear would eat her little baby, and the bear was likely thinking the same thing regarding her own babies. In a flash, the bear was back on top of Leanne. She glanced at her left arm and could see the bear's entire mouth wrapped around it. Smokey wasn't about to give up and initiated another ferocious attack of barking and growling as she ran toward the bear. Drawing the bear off of Leanne, Smokey retreated to the safety of the porch as the sow backed off in the direction of the tree holding her cubs. Leanne took this chance to crawl toward her back door. As she did, the sow continually bluff-charged and stormed around in a rage. As soon as she entered her home, Leanne closed the door and crawled across the kitchen floor toward her phone. She was certain that, had they not made it inside the home when they did, the bear would have killed her and Smokey. Smokey dashed upstairs as soon as she entered the home and hid under the bed. Leanne dialed 911 and begged for help. As she waited for the ambulance, she dreadfully considered what the back of her head looked like. She knew she was severely injured, as she was gushing blood from the wound there. Once the ambulance arrived at her address, they whisked her to Butler Memorial Hospital in town. Once she arrived at the hospital, Leanne's wound to her head was closed with dozens of surgical staples. The medical staff there determined that Leanne suffered a broken nose and facial bones, with puncture wounds to her head, neck, face, and arms from the sow's teeth and claws. Her scalp was torn open, and she suffered several gashes as well. Leanne's doctors say she was lucky that her injuries weren't more severe. Her pictures wouldn't pass YouTube guidelines, so I've posted them to my Patreon link below in the video article. If you'd like to take a look at them, they will show you what a bear will do to you. Dr. Philp was one of the trauma specialists working on Leanne's injuries. He indicated that over his 23-year career, he only had 1 or 2 other bear attack victims, and they were related to hunting. He stated that Leanne's was the first time his victim was attacked in her own backyard. Leanne's long-term prognosis is good, and she will make a full recovery after facial reconstruction surgery. When authorities investigated Leanne's neighborhood in search of the bear, they found the 4 bears had sought shelter in a tree. Upon arriving, the sow was very aggressive toward the officers, fostering concerns she might have rabies. Given that a rabies test can only be conducted on a dead animal, they had to euthanize her to find out. Her 3 cubs were sedated and held until a decision regarding their fate could be determined by the outcome of the rabies test on their mother. The rabies test was completed rapidly and was negative, indicating that her cubs could be released to live on their own in remote Warren County in the Allegheny National Forest. The video of their release is on my Patreon account if you'd like to view it there. The Pennsylvania Game Commission indicated that the sow was likely hungry and protecting her cubs. The neighborhood bird feeders likely proved too tempting for the sow, as she provided for herself and her cubs. For those of you who are wondering about Smokey, Leanne didn't get a chance to see him before she was taken to the hospital. Her son picked Smokey up and took him to the vet for an exam after his mother was admitted. It revealed that Smokey had a single small claw wound. That was her only injury. Leanne and Smokey were reunited as soon as she was discharged by Thursday afternoon of the same week. Leanne's neighbor, Nancy Godineaux, expressed frustration at authorities' lack of response prior to Leanne's bear attack. She stated that the bear could have been trapped and relocated before the incident had occurred. Leanne's bear attack was the 3rd one in the past year in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Game Commission indicates that there are about 2 bear attacks each year in the state, but points out that there has never been a fatal bear attack in Pennsylvania. Black bear populations in Pennsylvania have grown from 5,000 bears in 1980 to around 18,000 bears today. After reviewing the details of Leanne's bear attack, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think that game officials have been lackadaisical in their approach to the dangers black bears represent to citizens? Do you think a hazing program is in order to reestablish boundaries between bears and humans? Would relocating problem bears be a viable solution to the bear problems? Are you going to run out and buy a brave little black Pomeranian anytime soon? I might have to do that. I'll be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.